The Arabian Nights didn't begin in Arabia. They began in the fire-lit halls of Sassanid Persia, where professional storytellers entertained silk-robed nobles with a collection called Hezar Afsan, 1,000 stories. This was the 6th century, and the Sassanid Empire represented the last flowering of pre-Islamic Persian civilization. Here, storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was statecraft. Sassanid court culture had perfected narrative as a tool of power. Royal chroniclers transformed current events into legends that would outlive the kings themselves. Around braziers in winter palaces, master storytellers unfurled epic cycles that stretched for weeks, each night ending with carefully crafted suspense that guaranteed the audience's return. The technique was simple but revolutionary. Never finish a story when you can promise something better tomorrow. These Sassanid tales carried DNA from older civilizations. Indian merchants crossing the Hindu Kush brought collections like the Panchatantra, ancient beast fables that taught statecraft through animal allegory. A jackal's cunning could illustrate royal strategy without risking a storyteller's head. The Indians had mastered something crucial: stories within stories, nested like boxes, creating infinite loops of narrative that could theoretically continue forever. From Mesopotamia came even older currents. The Epic of Gilgamesh had established narrative templates 3 millennia before Muhammad was born. The hero's journey, the search for immortality, the tension between civilization and wildness. Egyptian scribes working in hieroglyphs had developed their own tradition of magical tales. Stories of pharaohs commanding jinn, of magicians raising the dead, of talking animals and enchanted objects. Then Islamic expansion changed everything. Within a century of the Prophet's death, Arab armies swept from Spain to India, creating an empire larger than Rome. But unlike previous conquerors, the Arabs proved to be cultural absorbers rather than destroyers. In conquered Persia, they adopted the Sassanid narrative tradition. In India, they translated local fables. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, they preserved ancient wisdom rather than erasing it. The Abbasid Caliphate, established in 750 AD, made this cultural fusion systematic. The new capital at Baghdad became the largest city in the world within decades. A cosmopolitan metropolis where Persian fire worshippers debated Jewish rabbis, where Christian monks translated Greek philosophy for Muslim scholars, where Indian mathematicians taught Arabic numerals to European traders. Caliph Harun al-Rashid established the House of Wisdom, an institution that would prove crucial to our story. This was part library, part translation academy, part research institute. Teams of scholars worked to translate every significant work they could find from Persian, Sanskrit, Greek, Syriac, and Hebrew into Arabic. They weren't just preserving knowledge, they were creating a common language for the world's stories. The translation movement reveals the civilization's hunger for knowledge from any source. Court chronicles from Persia, Indian philosophical dialogues, Greek scientific treatises, Jewish mystical texts, all flowed into Arabic and from there into the broader Muslim world. For the first time in history, the wisdom traditions of multiple civilizations became accessible in a single language. Trade routes accelerated this exchange. The Silk Road didn't just carry silk and spices, it carried tales. A merchant from Samarkand might tell a tale from Persia in Damascus, where Egyptian traders would carry it to Cairo, where it might be translated into Arabic and eventually reach Cordoba in Muslim Spain. An ancient Indian story about a magical flying horse, first recorded in Sanskrit, passed through Persian courts. was carried by merchants to Baghdad and eventually became the ebony horse in our collection. By the 9th century, Arabic had become the scholarly language from Spain to India. This linguistic unity created the first truly international market for narrative. Tales that succeeded in one part of the Muslim world spread rapidly to all others, creating pressure for narratives that appealed across cultural boundaries. Professional storytellers emerged in this environment naturally. In coffee houses and bazaars, men and women earned their living by holding audiences spellbound. These weren't simply entertainers. They were cultural memory keepers, moral instructors, and psychological healers. A skilled storyteller could make audiences laugh, cry, and leave pondering deep questions, all in a single evening. These narrators developed sophisticated techniques. Episodic structure allowed flexibility. Narratives were stretched or compressed depending on audience response. They mastered the cliffhanger that guaranteed return customers. Most importantly, they perfected the frame tale, a narrative containing other narratives, which provided continuity and meaning to what might otherwise be random collections. The frame tale also provided safety. Controversial or subversive narratives were told if embedded within morally acceptable frameworks. Sassanid narrators had pioneered this technique, but Arab storytellers perfected it, creating nested structures that theoretically continued forever. From this rich matrix emerged the collection we call the Arabian Nights, sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries. Its exact origins remain mysterious, but its cultural DNA traces back through all these converging streams. Court literature from Persia, Indian wisdom traditions, Mesopotamian mythology, Egyptian magic, and Muslim ethical thought. The choice of a storytelling woman as protagonist was revolutionary. In literature where women typically appeared as prizes or obstacles, Shahrazad emerged as the ultimate narrator who could command a king's attention through voice alone. This wasn't just entertainment. It was a radical reimagining of where power resided in human relationships. As tales coalesced around this frame, they attracted more narratives like a magnet: local folk tales, court anecdotes, religious parables, merchants' adventures, all found their way into the growing cycle. The collection became organic, constantly growing as new tellers added their voices. The Sassanid narrators, who first developed the Thousand Tales format, understood something profound: that narrative was infinite, that human appetite for tales was inexhaustible, that the right narrative told at the right moment might change minds and hearts. They created techniques for serial storytelling that would survive the fall of their empire and find new life in Islamic civilization. The House of Wisdom's translation project did more than preserve ancient texts. It created a library of human experience that any storyteller could draw from. A narrator in 9th century Baghdad had access to wisdom traditions spanning continents and millennia. Persian epics, Indian fables, Greek myths, Mesopotamian legends, Egyptian magic, all available in Arabic, all ready to be woven into new patterns. The merchant networks that connected this vast Islamic world created unprecedented opportunities for story exchange. Tales tested in Damascus coffee houses could reach Cairo bazaars within months. Successful narrative innovations spread like wildfire. The best storytellers became celebrities, their techniques copied across the empire. This was the world that produced the Arabian Nights, a civilization confident enough to absorb influences from anywhere, sophisticated enough to synthesize them into something new, and wealthy enough to support professional artists who perfected the result. It was a culture that understood tales as more than entertainment, as tools for education, persuasion, and transformation. The techniques developed in this golden age, serial narrative, embedded stories, cliffhanger endings, the frame tale structure, would influence world literature for centuries, but they reached their perfect expression in the voice of one fictional woman who understood that the right story, told at the right moment, could mean the difference between life and death. When Shahrazad entered King Shahryar's chamber, carrying the accumulated wisdom of ages, she bore more than her own cleverness. She carried Sassanid narrative techniques, Indian moral wisdom, Mesopotamian mythic power, and Muslim ethical insight. She was about to deploy humanity's most sophisticated arsenal in the ultimate test, changing a murderer's heart through the perfect tale, night after night, for 1,000 nights and one. Shahryar discovered his wife's betrayal on what should have been the happiest day of his reign. Returning early from a military campaign against rebellious tribes on the Persian frontier, he found her in the palace gardens with a kitchen slave. Not stolen moments of passion, but brazen daylight coupling, while the ruler fought for his kingdom's honor. The sight didn't just wound him, it shattered his fundamental understanding of loyalty, honor, and human nature itself. The monarch's wife wasn't some neglected queen, driven to desperate acts. She had been showered with silk from China, pearls from the Indian Ocean, and gold from Nubian mines. Her chambers rivaled those of Byzantine empresses. She commanded dozens of servants and enjoyed freedoms that most women of her era could never imagine. Yet she had chosen a man who slept on kitchen straw and ate table scraps. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was a complete negation of everything the ruler believed about justice, reward, and the natural order. In his rage, Shahryar didn't just execute his wife and her lover. He had them tortured publicly, their screams echoing through the palace courtyards as a warning to anyone who might question royal authority. But the torture couldn't erase what he had seen or heal what had been broken inside him. If his own wife, elevated above all other women in the kingdom, betrayed him with the lowest man available, then all women were inherently treacherous. His logic was brutal, but to his wounded mind, unassailable. The sovereign's solution emerged from this twisted reasoning. Each evening, he selected a virgin from his kingdom, someone young enough to be uncorrupted by previous relationships, beautiful enough to deserve royal attention, and pure enough to represent feminine virtue at its theoretical peak. Each dawn, he executed her before she could reveal her inevitable treacherous nature. This wasn't passion or madness. It was systematic prevention, a cold attempt to solve what he saw as an inherent flaw in female character. For 3 years, this ritual continued with mechanical precision. The royal executioner, once employed only for criminals and traitors, found himself killing innocent girls daily. He grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, but he dared not refuse his duties. Ministers whispered of divine punishment for such injustice, but none spoke openly against a ruler whose grief had calcified into something monstrous. The kingdom's noble families began fleeing with their daughters to distant provinces or foreign lands. The vizier, architect of this horror through his duty to find the brides, watched his own soul deteriorate with each name he provided. As the sovereign's chief minister and closest advisor, it fell to him to maintain the supply of victims. Each family he approached meant another household's anguish, another young life cut short at dawn. The weight of enabling this systematic murder grew unbearable, but refusing the monarch meant death for his entire household, including his own daughters. The vizier had served 3 rulers and survived palace coups, foreign invasions, and religious upheavals. He understood political survival and the art of managing royal temperament. But this situation transcended normal court intrigue. His master had become something unprecedented. a leader whose personal pain had transformed into systematic policy, whose individual trauma had become the kingdom's collective nightmare. Traditional methods of counsel and influence had proven useless against such calcified grief. Into this seemingly hopeless situation stepped the vizier's eldest daughter. At 25, she was past the usual age for marriage in her culture, but her father had indulged her unusual appetite for learning. She had studied in Baghdad's great libraries, mastering not just Arabic literature but Persian poetry, Indian philosophy, Greek science, and Jewish mysticism. More crucially, she had absorbed the narrative traditions of a dozen cultures, understanding story not just as entertainment, but as a tool for human transformation. Her education had been extraordinary, even by the standards of her privileged class. While most noble daughters learned music, embroidery, and household management, she had convinced her father to hire the same tutors who educated princes. She could recite the entire Quran from memory, discuss Aristotelian logic with court philosophers, and navigate the complex genealogies of Arab tribal poetry. But her true expertise lay in understanding how stories worked on the human mind, how the right tale, told at the right moment, could change hearts and reshape souls. When the vizier's daughter announced her intention to marry the monarch, her father's reaction was immediate and desperate. He had watched her grow into one of the most intellectually accomplished women in the kingdom, and now she proposed to throw her life away on what appeared to be elaborate suicide. No amount of cleverness had saved the previous wives. Intelligence meant nothing to a ruler who had ceased seeing his brides as human beings. The vizier begged, threatened, and pleaded, but her resolve remained unshakable. But she had studied the sovereign's pattern with the analytical mind of a military strategist. She understood that his wound wasn't really about female betrayal. It was about his inability to see women as fully human. Each wife had been reduced to an object in his mind, a possession to be discarded when it disappointed him. The previous brides had approached their fate as victims, pleading for mercy or raging against injustice. None had attempted to make the ruler see them as complete persons, worthy of genuine consideration. Her strategy required careful preparation and a crucial accomplice. Her younger sister, Dunyazad, though only 16, possessed the intelligence and courage necessary for what amounted to a palace coup conducted through storytelling. The plan they developed together was intricate, dangerous, and unprecedented. They intended to use the accumulated narrative wisdom of world literature to perform psychological warfare on a sovereign whose heart had turned to stone. The sisters spent weeks rehearsing their roles. Dunyazad practiced her timing, learning to arrive at the chamber door at precisely the right moment, after the monarch had exhausted himself with his new bride, but before he had settled into sleep. Her request had to sound spontaneous, but never desperate. "Sister, tell me one of those wonderful tales you know, to help me pass this sleepless evening." Most importantly, Dunyazad had to genuinely project love and concern for her sister, because the ruler's ability to detect deception had been honed by years of court intrigue. This wasn't improvisation, it was psychological warfare of the highest sophistication. Dunyazad's presence transformed the dynamic completely. No longer was this a sovereign alone with a disposable wife, waiting for dawn and another execution. Now there was a family, relationships that mattered, people who genuinely cared about each other. The sister's obvious affection for the storyteller forced the monarch to confront her humanity in a way he had systematically avoided with previous wives. The transformation of space was equally important. The royal bedchamber, which had become a site of mechanical coupling, followed by patient waiting for execution, became a place where stories were told where imagination flourished, where the human capacity for wonder could resurface. The eldest daughter understood that environment shapes consciousness, and she intended to reshape the psychological landscape of those midnight hours completely. The first evening began as all the others had for 3 years. Shahryar took his pleasure with dutiful efficiency, then lay back expecting to wait for dawn and the familiar routine of execution. His mind had become accustomed to these hours, not sleeping, but not truly awake either, existing in a state of suspended anticipation that had replaced any capacity for genuine rest or peace. Then came the soft knock at the chamber door, Dunyazad's voice asking permission to enter, and her sister's carefully modulated response. "Come, beloved sister, I gladly tell you a tale to ease your restlessness, if our Lord the Sovereign permits such humble entertainment." The words were deferential, but they contained multiple layers of psychological manipulation. The storyteller acknowledged royal authority while simultaneously positioning herself as someone who provided comfort to others, someone whose loss meant genuine grief. Her voice that first evening was unlike anything the monarch had encountered in 3 years of brides. She didn't plead for her life or curse her fate. She didn't attempt seduction or make promises of loyalty. Instead, she began to weave a verbal tapestry so compelling that the ruler found himself drawn in despite his intentions. This wasn't the desperate babbling of a terrified girl. This was the voice of someone who understood narrative as a form of magic, someone who could reshape reality through the sheer power of well-chosen words. The tale she selected for that crucial first evening revealed her sophisticated understanding of psychology and literature. The merchant and the Jinni wasn't chosen randomly from her vast repertoire. It was a carefully constructed argument about justice, mercy, and the danger of absolute judgments disguised as an entertaining story. A merchant traveling through the desert carelessly throws date pits after eating, accidentally striking and killing the invisible son of a powerful Jinni. The Jinni appears in a rage, demanding the merchant's life in payment for what was clearly an unintentional act. The parallel to the sovereign's situation was unmistakable, but never explicitly stated. Both the Jinni and the ruler were dispensing harsh justice for perceived wrongs. Both had allowed pain to transform them into instruments of arbitrary vengeance. Both had ceased to distinguish between intentional malice and accidental harm. The merchant in the story, like the young women the monarch had been executing, was fundamentally innocent of malicious intent, yet faced death because of another's inability to process grief constructively. But her genius lay not just in the tale's thematic content, but in its sophisticated narrative structure. The merchant's story contained 3 additional tales told by mysterious old men who appeared in the desert, each offering to trade 1/3 of the merchant's blood debt in exchange for telling their own stories of wonder. This created a nested structure that demonstrated several crucial principles: that stories had value, that narrative could be traded for life itself, and that the act of telling tales created bonds between teller and audience that transcended simple entertainment. As dawn approached and the story reached its climax, the first old man beginning his tale of transformation and enchantment, the storyteller simply stopped. "I continue with this wonder," she said, "but I see that morning has arrived, and I fear to weary our Lord with overlong speech." The words were humble, but the effect was anything but submissive. For the first time in 3 years, the monarch faced a choice more compelling than his systematic cruelty. Kill her now and never learn how the story ended, or spare her another day to satisfy his curiosity. That moment of hesitation was everything she had gambled on. The crack in the ruler's armor of systematic vengeance was microscopic, but it was enough. She had demonstrated that something in this world, narrative art, could prove more compelling than his rage. The story had created a space where his humanity could resurface, where the man he had been before his wife's betrayal could briefly reappear. The psychological brilliance of her method becomes clear when we understand what she was really accomplishing. Each evening, she created a temporary sanctuary where the sovereign's wounded soul could heal incrementally. While absorbed in her tales, he forgot to be the tyrannical executioner and became simply a man hearing wonderful stories. The gradual transformation wasn't magical. It was the result of sustained exposure to narratives that challenged his assumptions about human nature, justice, and the possibility of redemption. Dunyazad's role proved equally crucial to the success of this unprecedented intervention. Evening after evening, she returned to request another tale, and each time her obvious love for her sister forced the monarch to confront what he was planning to destroy. A man might kill a nameless possession without thought, but destroying someone who was genuinely loved, someone whose death caused real grief to another human being, required a level of callousness that even the ruler's wounded heart couldn't quite achieve. The frame tale structure that the storyteller employed was itself a form of sophisticated psychological manipulation. By embedding stories within stories, she created narrative loops that were almost impossible to escape mentally. Just as one tale seemed to approach resolution, another began, each connected to the last by character relationships, thematic parallels, or simple curiosity about outcomes. The sovereign found himself trapped not by physical chains, but by his own desire to understand, to learn, to experience the satisfaction of narrative completion. The stories she chose revealed deep understanding of masculine psychology and the specific wounds that had shaped the monarch's character. She didn't lecture about women's virtue or men's capacity for cruelty. Instead, she told tales where clever characters, both male and female, solved impossible problems through wit rather than force, where mercy proved more effective than vengeance, where understanding human complexity led to better outcomes than rigid moral judgment. She was teaching through example rather than argument, allowing the ruler to draw his own conclusions from carefully selected evidence. As the evenings accumulated into weeks, then months, the transformation began to accelerate. The sovereign, who had once seen women as inherently treacherous, began encountering female characters of remarkable intelligence, loyalty, and moral strength in the storyteller's tales. The man who had believed harsh justice was the only effective response to human failings, heard story after story where mercy and understanding achieved better results than punishment and revenge. Most importantly, the ruler who had forgotten how to see his subjects as fully human gradually remembered what it meant to care about individual lives and stories. Her endurance was as remarkable as her intelligence. Evening after evening, for months, then years, she had to be simultaneously creative, compelling, and strategically careful. A boring tale might mean death, but so might a story that challenged the monarch too directly, or moved too quickly toward conclusions he wasn't psychologically prepared to accept. She was walking an intellectual and emotional tightrope, using every technique that world literature had developed to maintain perfect balance between entertainment and transformation. The stories she told weren't random selections from folklore. They were carefully chosen psychological interventions, each designed to address specific aspects of the ruler's wounded psyche. When the sovereign seemed particularly harsh or inflexible, she told tales of mercy rewarded and rigidity punished. When his misogyny surfaced, She presented female characters of such obvious virtue and intelligence that dismissing them required willful blindness. When his pain seemed overwhelming, she offered stories of healing, redemption, and the possibility that even the most damaged hearts could learn to love again. The kingdom watched this strange contest between story and sword with growing hope. Months passed without the daily executions that had defined the royal routine. Families began returning with their daughters from distant provinces and foreign exile. The royal court, which had become a place of dread and whispered conversations, slowly remembered how to laugh, to hope, to believe in the possibility of justice and mercy. The storyteller wasn't just saving her own life. She was healing an entire realm through the transformative power of narrative art. By the end of the second year, something unprecedented was happening in the royal bedchamber. The monarch was asking questions about the stories, engaging with their themes, discussing their moral implications with genuine curiosity rather than suspicious analysis. The man who had once dismissed literature as frivolous entertainment was discovering that tales could contain more practical wisdom than philosophy, more essential truth than history, more healing power than medicine or religion. The relationship between storyteller and audience had evolved into something neither participant had initially envisioned. She had begun as a desperate woman, employing her only weapon against systematic murder. He had started as a broken ruler, seeking temporary distraction from unbearable pain, but gradually, incrementally, they had become collaborators in an exploration of human nature through the lens of the world's greatest stories. The executioner's block remained in the palace courtyard, but its shadow grew fainter with each passing evening, each completed tale, each moment of genuine connection between two souls who had found unexpected common ground in the realm of imagination. The executioner's axe had grown dull from disuse. For the first time in 3 years, the palace blacksmith wasn't required to sharpen it daily. Word spread through Baghdad's narrow streets that something impossible was happening. The vizier's daughter had survived not just one dawn, but dozens. Children who had never heard their mothers sing lullabies, afraid that any expression of joy might attract the sovereign's deadly attention, began to whisper narratives of their own. But survival was only the beginning. She understood that keeping the monarch interested required more than clever cliffhangers. She needed to build a curriculum of the soul, a carefully orchestrated progression through the deepest questions of human existence. Each narrative had to entertain, while secretly performing surgery on a heart that had calcified into stone. Her strategy revealed itself through the selections she chose in those crucial early months. The Merchant and the Jinni had been the perfect opener, a narrative about unintended consequences and the possibility that even supernatural rage could be reasoned with. But now she needed to go deeper, to explore the psychological landscape that had created a ruler who could execute innocent women without remorse. The poor fisherman and the brass vessel arrived at precisely the right moment. The protagonist, poor, humble, struggling to feed his family, casts his net 4 times each day, as religious law prescribes. 3 times he pulls up garbage, broken pottery, rotting fish, worthless debris. But the 4th cast brings up an ancient brass vessel, sealed with the signet of Solomon himself. Inside, a jinn so massive that his head touches the clouds, so ancient that his rage has fermented into cosmic fury. Her voice painted this scene with visceral detail. The spirit emerges as black smoke that takes human form, speaking in a voice like thunder. Prepare to die, O mortal. Choose how you wish to perish. This wasn't the controlled vengeance of the first supernatural being. This was rage that had metastasized beyond all reason. The creature had been imprisoned for so long that he had passed through every stage of anger into something approaching madness. But here, the narrative took its crucial turn. The poor man doesn't beg or attempt to flee. Instead, he employs pure psychological warfare. How could such an enormous creature fit inside such a tiny bottle? Surely you're lying to make yourself seem more impressive. The spirit, despite his cosmic strength, falls for this simple trick of wounded pride. He transforms back into smoke and squeezes into the vessel to prove his claim, whereupon the clever mortal immediately seals him inside again. The monarch, listening in the lamplight, found himself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time since his wife's betrayal. But the narrator wasn't finished. She had the poor man make a deal with the trapped being, freedom in exchange for a favor. The jinn, humbled by his own pride, agrees to grant the mortal one wish. And what does the humble protagonist choose? Not gold or dominion or revenge against those who had kept him in poverty. He asks simply to be led to fish that will feed his family. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a masterclass in alternative responses to strength and rage. The protagonist had controlled a supernatural force not through violence but through cleverness. He had used his advantage not for personal aggrandizement but for simple, honest sustenance. Most importantly, he had shown mercy to a creature that had threatened to kill him moments before. The spirit leads the mortal to an enchanted lake where 4 colored fish swim: white, red, blue, and yellow. When the protagonist presents these to the local sultan, the fish speak when placed in a cooking pan, begging not to be eaten. This impossible event leads to the discovery of an entire city transformed by magic. The city of the 4 colored fish, where a ruler's cruelty to his wife has resulted in half the population being turned to stone. Now the narrator was working with surgical precision. The city of the 4 colored fish contained a sovereign whose jealous rage had literally petrified half his kingdom. Every day, the transformed ruler could move only from the waist up, while his legs remained marble. A perfect metaphor for a leader whose heart had hardened while his head still functioned. His wife, revealed to be a powerful sorceress, visited him daily to beat him with a whip before going to her lover, whom she kept barely alive through magic. The parallels were becoming impossible to ignore. Here was a narrative of marital betrayal that had led to systematic cruelty, of a sovereign whose response to infidelity had created widespread suffering, of a kingdom where the ruler's personal pain had become everyone's nightmare. But this account offered something the monarch's real life had not: resolution through intervention and justice. The visiting sultan in the narrative doesn't simply observe this horror, he acts. He kills the evil lover, disguises himself to trick the sorceress, and ultimately breaks the enchantment that has cursed the entire city. The marble monarch regains his mobility, the stone people return to life, and the kingdom is restored to health. Magic here represents the possibility that even the most calcified situations can be transformed through courage, cleverness, and decisive action. But the narrator embedded an even more sophisticated message within this account. The visiting sultan's intervention succeeds not because he uses greater force than the sorceress, but because he employs deception and patience. He studies the situation, understands the magical routine, and then systematically undermines it. The lesson was clear. Intelligence and planning could overcome even supernatural malice. The 3 dervishes and the 3 ladies of Baghdad pushed the psychological exploration into even more complex territory. 3 men, each missing his right eye, arrive at a magnificent house where 3 beautiful women live in apparent independence. The ladies welcome them with extraordinary hospitality, but establish one inviolable rule: Ask no questions about anything you see here, no matter how strange it might appear. This setup immediately created narrative tension while exploring themes that struck at the heart of the sovereign's psychological wounds. The dervishes must learn to accept mystery, to trust without complete understanding, to find peace in relationships where total knowledge isn't possible. For a ruler whose wife's betrayal had shattered his faith in the knowability of others, this was profound medicine disguised as adventure. Each dervish's account of how he lost his eye revealed different aspects of masculine psychology under stress. The first had fallen in love with his cousin, only to discover she was being forced into marriage with another man. His attempt to rescue her led to disaster. She was killed, he was blinded, and his entire family was destroyed. His narrative explored the dangerous intersection of love, honor, and violence, showing how masculine codes of behavior could lead to tragedy for everyone involved. The second dervish's account delved into themes of curiosity, ambition, and the price of forbidden knowledge. He had been a prince who discovered a hidden door in his palace, despite explicit warnings never to open it. Behind the door lay a beautiful woman, imprisoned by a spirit, and his attempt to rescue her led to his own transformation and exile. His narrative examined the masculine impulse to fix, to save, to intervene, and the devastating consequences when that impulse encounters forces beyond human understanding. The third dervish revealed himself to be a prince whose kingdom had been stolen by a treacherous vizier. His account explored themes of political betrayal, the precariousness of authority, and the way that rulers who trust too easily can lose everything. But his narrative also demonstrated resilience. Despite losing his kingdom, his eye, and his identity, he had found peace as a wandering holy man. The three ladies' own accounts proved even more psychologically sophisticated. They revealed hidden identities as princesses whose kingdoms had been destroyed by magical forces, whose families had been murdered or transformed, whose apparent independence was actually a form of protective exile. Their narratives showed women as complex individuals with their own agency, intelligence, and capacity for both suffering and strength. But the evening's true revelation came when the Caliph Harun al-Rashid himself appeared in disguise among the guests. The narrator was introducing her audience to the concept of the wise ruler who walked among his people to understand their true condition. Harun al-Rashid, a real historical figure who had become legendary for his justice and wisdom, served as a counterexample to tyrannical sovereignty. In the narrative, when the dervishes and ladies finish their accounts, the caliph reveals his identity and uses his authority not for punishment but for restoration. He helps reunite separated lovers, restores lost kingdoms, and rewards virtue wherever he finds it. The message was unmistakable. True royal strength lay in healing rather than harming, in building rather than destroying, in mercy rather than vengeance. The Hunchback's adventure introduced an entirely different element, absurdist comedy that revealed the arbitrary nature of guilt and punishment. A couple accidentally chokes a hunchbacked entertainer and, panicking, dumps the body in their neighbor's house. The neighbor, discovering the corpse, assumes he has somehow caused the death and passes the problem to someone else. This creates a chain of misunderstandings where each person constructs an elaborate narrative to explain what they think happened, and every account is completely wrong. The narrative's genius lay in its exploration of how people create explanations for events they don't fully understand. Each character who encounters the dead hunchback develops an entire theory of causation based on incomplete information. The tailor assumes he killed the man by startling him. The doctor thinks his medicine caused the death, The merchant believes his blow knocked the man down the stairs. None of them are correct, but each is absolutely convinced by his own version of events. For a ruler who had constructed an entire worldview based on his interpretation of his wife's betrayal, this was devastating commentary. The narrator was showing him, through laughter, that human understanding is always incomplete, and that the explanations we create for events may bear little resemblance to actual truth. But the hunchback narrative didn't end with simple comedy. When all the supposed culprits are brought before the authorities, each tells an account to prove his innocence and worthiness to live. This creates another frame narrative, where oral tradition literally becomes a matter of life and death, a situation that mirrored the narrator's own predicament exactly. The embedded accounts within the hunchback cycle explored every aspect of human nature: love and betrayal, wisdom and folly, generosity and greed, loyalty and treachery. The overall effect was to demonstrate that human nature itself is endlessly complex, and that simple moral judgments rarely capture the full truth of any situation. The porter and the three ladies of Baghdad pushed the boundaries by introducing explicitly erotic elements alongside supernatural adventure. A poor porter, hired to carry groceries for mysterious women, finds himself invited into a world of luxury, beauty, and sophisticated pleasure. His experience reveals how chance encounters can transform lives and challenges simple stereotypes about desire, class, and feminine agency. The narrative explored themes that were particularly relevant to the monarch's psychology. The porter's assumption that beautiful, wealthy women would be sexually available to him leads to comic misunderstanding. But the women ultimately prove to be complex individuals with their own desires, rules, and autonomy. They aren't prizes to be won or possessions to be controlled. They are people making their own choices about pleasure, companionship, and trust. These early narratives established patterns that would govern the entire collection. Each account contained multiple layers of meaning that could be appreciated differently depending on the audience's psychological readiness. Surface adventure concealed deeper explorations of authority, justice, love, and the possibility of personal transformation. The supernatural elements weren't mere fantasy. They were psychological metaphors made concrete. Spirits represented the forces of rage and desire that humans struggle to control. Magical transformations showed how people could be changed by trauma, love, or wisdom. Enchanted objects demonstrated that the ordinary world contained hidden forces that could be unlocked by the right knowledge or the right heart. Perhaps most importantly, these narratives demonstrated that oral tradition itself possessed transformative strength. Characters within the accounts were constantly being changed by the narratives they heard or shared. Spirits were convinced to spare lives. Magical curses were broken through persistent recitation, and hostile strangers became allies through shared accounts. The monarch was learning, through accumulated example, that the narratives he heard each evening weren't simply entertainment. They were a form of magic that was working changes in his own heart and mind. The executioner's block remained in the palace courtyard, but its influence over the royal imagination was weakening in the face of more compelling alternatives. Evening after evening, account after account, the narrator was building a new reality where mercy was stronger than vengeance, where understanding trumped judgment, where the healing strength of oral tradition could transform even the most damaged hearts. The foundation was laid for the greater wonders that were yet to come. By the end of her first year, the vizier's daughter had accomplished something unprecedented. She had transformed the royal bedchamber from a place of impending death into a theatre of imagination. The monarch no longer lay awake, calculating how many hours remained until dawn's execution. Instead, he found himself genuinely curious about outcomes, emotionally invested in fictional characters, and, most remarkably, capable of experiencing suspense, wonder, and even joy. But surviving 365 nights required more than clever diversions. The ruler's psychological transformation demanded deeper intervention, more sophisticated challenges to his worldview. The narratives she had shared thus far, magical encounters, supernatural interventions, divine intervention, had begun the work of healing. Now she needed to address the political and moral dimensions of leadership itself. The 7 Viziers cycle marked a dramatic escalation in both narrative complexity and thematic ambition. This wasn't a single account, but an intricate web of interconnected chronicles that would unfold over weeks, each more psychologically penetrating than the last. The framework was deceptively simple. A young prince, falsely accused of attempting to seduce his stepmother, is condemned to death by his father. 7 wise counselors each request a day's delay to tell the king a cautionary account about the dangers of hasty judgment. The setup immediately established parallels that the monarch couldn't ignore. Here was another ruler whose personal relationships had been poisoned by betrayal, or the appearance of betrayal. Here was another leader whose pain and rage were driving him towards systematic injustice. But unlike the listening ruler's own situation, this fictional framework offered the possibility of intervention, reflection, and ultimately, wisdom. The first vizier's account, the merchant's wife and the parrot, introduced themes that would resonate throughout the entire cycle. A merchant, suspecting his spouse of infidelity, purchases a talking parrot to spy on her activities while he travels. The bird reports conversations between the woman and her lover, leading the merchant to kill his spouse in a jealous rage. Only later does he discover that the woman's sister had taught the parrot to lie, wanting to destroy the marriage out of her own spite. The merchant had murdered an innocent woman based on false evidence provided by a creature he trusted completely. The parallel to the monarch's situation was surgical in its precision. Both rulers had accepted evidence of betrayal without sufficient investigation. Both had responded with lethal violence. Both had discovered, or were being invited to consider, that their assumptions about guilt and innocence might have been catastrophically wrong. The message embedded within entertainment was unmistakable. Absolute judgment based on incomplete information inevitably leads to injustice. The second vizier's contribution, the king and his son's bride, explored even more dangerous territory. A ruler discovers his son's spouse attempting to seduce him and immediately condemns her to death. But the woman reveals that she was acting on her husband's orders. The prince wanted to test his father's virtue and had commanded his bride to make the attempt. The king's hasty judgment would have destroyed not only an innocent woman, but the very relationship she was trying to protect through her unwilling deception. This narrative struck at the heart of the listening ruler's psychological wounds, while offering a radical reframe. What if apparent betrayal was actually a test? What if seeming disloyalty masked deeper loyalty? What if the capacity to withstand temptation was more valuable than the elimination of all tempting circumstances? The vizier's daughter was systematically dismantling the philosophical foundations that supported systematic mistrust and preemptive violence. The fuller and his spouse delved into themes of reputation, social pressure, and the gap between public perception and private reality. A launderer discovers his bride in what appears to be a compromising situation with another man. Rather than killing her immediately, he decides to investigate further and discovers that she was actually preventing the man from committing suicide over his debts. Her apparent infidelity was actually an act of mercy and social responsibility. The fuller's initial impulse toward violence would have destroyed both his marriage and the life his partner was trying to save. Each embedded narrative within the Seven Viziers cycle functioned as a precision instrument designed to address specific aspects of the ruler's pathology. The accounts explored jealousy, revenge, the unreliability of evidence, the complexity of human motivation, and the devastating consequences of leaders who prioritize their personal pain over their subjects' welfare. But they also offered alternatives: patience over haste, investigation over assumption, mercy over vengeance, wisdom over emotional reaction. The merchant and the two sharpers introduced questions about fairness, punishment, and the difference between legal and moral authority. Two con artists swindle an honest merchant out of his life savings through an elaborate scheme involving false contracts and corrupt officials. When the merchant appeals to the courts, he discovers that the legal system itself has been compromised by bribes and political influence. Proper resolution through official channels proves impossible, forcing the merchant to seek alternative forms of redress. This narrative served multiple functions in the narrator's psychological campaign. It demonstrated that official authority, the kind the monarch wielded, could become corrupted and cease to serve righteousness. It showed that wise individuals sometimes needed to work outside established systems to achieve fair outcomes. Most importantly, it suggested that true fairness required more than simple application of legal codes. It demanded understanding, investigation, and genuine concern for victims, rather than mechanical punishment of presumed offenders. The merchant's ultimate solution proves both clever and morally instructive. Rather than seeking revenge through violence, he devises an elaborate scheme to expose the con artists publicly, while returning stolen property to all their victims. His approach serves righteousness while avoiding the cycle of violence and retribution that had characterized the listening ruler's own response to betrayal. The King Yunnan and the sage Duban presented one of the collection's most sophisticated explorations of political authority and the relationship between rulers and their advisors. King Yunnan suffers from leprosy that has made him a pariah among his own courtiers. A wise physician named Duban arrives offering a cure that seems impossible. The monarch can be healed simply by gripping a special polo mallet during a game. The treatment works perfectly, restoring the ruler's health and social standing. But the king's joy in his cure is poisoned by his vizier's jealousy and suspicion. The minister convinces the ruler that Duban's magical abilities make him dangerous. If he can cure with such ease, surely he can kill just as effortlessly. The vizier argues that any man with such capabilities represents an existential threat to royal authority and must be eliminated before he chooses to use his abilities for harmful purposes. The parallels to the listening monarch's situation were becoming impossible to ignore. Here was another ruler who had allowed advisors to convince him that preemptive violence was necessary for political survival. Here was another king who had chosen to destroy someone who had served him faithfully out of fear about what that person might theoretically do in the future. The wise physician's execution would represent the triumph of paranoid suspicion over grateful recognition of genuine service. But the narrator's presentation of this chronicle included a crucial twist that elevated it beyond simple moral instruction. When King Yunnan orders Duban's execution, the physician requests permission to give the ruler a special book as a final gift. The book appears to be blank, but Duban explains that the words will appear when the king licks his finger to turn each page. The book has been treated with poison, and the act of reading it slowly kills the monarch, who was so concerned about potential threats that he destroyed actual allies. The message was devastating in its elegant simplicity. Rulers who prioritize imaginary future dangers over present realities inevitably destroy themselves. The leader who trusts no one ultimately dies alone. The monarch who preemptively eliminates all potential threats creates the very isolation that makes him genuinely vulnerable. The Enchanted Prince offered a different kind of political allegory, one focused on the relationship between personal transformation and effective leadership. A young ruler has been transformed into a half-marble statue by his spouse's magic. He can speak and think, but cannot move or act. His kingdom reflects his condition. Half the population has been turned to stone. Half the buildings have crumbled, and half the natural world has withered into lifelessness. The Enchanted Prince's situation serves as a perfect metaphor for leadership that has become calcified by trauma, anger, or despair. The ruler retains his intelligence and his official authority, but has lost the capacity for effective action. His subjects suffer not because he actively harms them, but because his inability to function properly as a leader creates systemic dysfunction throughout the realm. The prince's transformation resulted from his discovery of his bride's infidelity and his violent response to it. Like the listening monarch, he had allowed personal betrayal to poison his capacity for effective governance. The magical curse that immobilized him represented the psychological paralysis that can result when rulers become obsessed with personal grievances rather than public responsibilities. But this chronicle also offered hope through its resolution. The Enchanted Prince is ultimately healed, not through violence or revenge, but through the intervention of a wise sultan who investigates the situation carefully, understands the magical dynamics involved, and then systematically works to break the curse. The healing process requires patience, intelligence, and genuine concern for the welfare of all the kingdom's inhabitants, including the Enchanted Prince himself. The three apples represented a dramatic departure from the supernatural adventures that had dominated previous cycles. This narrative was essentially a murder mystery, one of the earliest examples of detective fiction in world literature. But its psychological and political implications were profound. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid discovers a chest containing the dismembered body of a beautiful young woman. His investigation reveals a complex web of miscommunication, jealousy, and hasty judgment that ultimately leads to tragedy. The murdered woman's husband had killed her based on circumstantial evidence that seemed to prove her infidelity. Like so many rulers in the collection's various chronicles, he had acted on incomplete information, allowing jealousy to override investigation and emotional reaction to substitute for careful judgment. The woman's actual innocence is revealed only after her death, when the real circumstances behind the apparent evidence of betrayal become clear. But the narrative's most sophisticated element was its exploration of the investigation process itself. Harun al-Rashid doesn't simply punish the husband for murder. He works to understand how such a tragedy could have occurred and what systemic failures allowed a fundamentally good man to become a killer. The Caliph's approach to judgment emphasizes understanding and prevention rather than simple retribution. The resolution reveals that the apparent evidence of the woman's infidelity was created by a series of innocent misunderstandings and coincidences that, when viewed together, seem to tell a clear narrative of betrayal. The husband's tragic error was his unwillingness to investigate further before acting on his assumptions. The chronicle's message was clear. Even the most compelling evidence can mislead, and wise judgment requires patience, investigation, and genuine commitment to discovering truth rather than confirming suspicions. The City of Brass transported both narrator and audience into realms of pure imagination while exploring themes of political power, historical memory, and the ultimate futility of earthly authority. An expedition organized by the Caliph to discover the legendary City of Brass, a metropolis whose inhabitants were all transformed into metal statues as punishment for their pride and materialism, becomes a meditation on the transitory nature of all human achievement. The explorers discover a magnificent city whose architecture surpasses anything in the contemporary world, but whose population consists entirely of brass figures frozen in their final moments of life. Inscriptions throughout the city reveal that its inhabitants had believed their wealth, military strength, and technological achievements made them invulnerable to divine judgment. Their transformation into metal serves as a warning about the ultimate consequences of pride, materialism, and the belief that earthly authority can substitute for moral responsibility. But the City of Brass narrative also functions as a sophisticated exploration of historical memory and the responsibility of contemporary rulers to learn from past mistakes. The expedition members aren't simply tourists observing ancient ruins. They are leaders whose own decisions will determine whether their civilizations avoid the fate that befell the Brass City's inhabitants. The chronicle's most powerful moment comes when the expedition discovers the city's former ruler, now a brass statue seated on his throne, with an inscription that reads, "O you who come after us, take warning from our fate. We possessed all that the world could offer, but it availed us nothing when divine judgment arrived. Learn wisdom from our failure, and govern your own realms with righteousness and humility." These heroic cycles represented a fundamental shift in the narrator's strategy. The early chronicles had focused primarily on supernatural interventions and magical solutions to human problems. These later narratives grounded their moral instruction in recognizably political and social realities. The lessons were becoming more direct, the parallels to the ruler's own situation more unmistakable, the challenges to his worldview more systematic and comprehensive. The cumulative effect of these chronicles was to demonstrate that effective leadership required wisdom, patience, investigation, and genuine concern for subjects' welfare, rather than simple assertion of authority through violence. The greatest rulers in these accounts weren't those who possessed the most military strength or the most feared reputations. They were those who understood human nature, investigated carefully before making judgments, and prioritized fairness over personal satisfaction. Perhaps most importantly, these narratives consistently showed that the problems which seemed to require violent solutions could usually be resolved through intelligence, patience, and genuine commitment to understanding complex situations. The rulers who succeeded were those who recognized that their personal pain and anger, however justified, could not be allowed to override their responsibilities to their subjects and their commitment to genuine righteousness. The monarch who had begun this process as a man, convinced that systematic violence was the only solution to human treachery, was gradually being exposed to alternative models of leadership and moral judgment. The transformation wasn't magical. It was the result of sustained exposure to narratives that challenged his assumptions while offering compelling alternatives. The executioner's block remained in the palace courtyard, but with each passing evening, each completed chronicle, each moment of genuine engagement with these fictional explorations of power and responsibility, its influence over the royal imagination continued to diminish. The foundation was being laid for even greater challenges to the ruler's worldview, chronicles that would test his growing capacity for mercy, wisdom, and genuine moral judgment. The narrator had successfully transformed survival into education, entertainment into therapy, and storytelling into the most sophisticated form of political counsel ever devised. 2 years into her extraordinary gamble, the vizier's daughter faced an unexpected challenge: success itself. The ruler had become so thoroughly invested in her chronicles that he now demanded increasingly spectacular adventures, more exotic wonders, grander scales of imagination. The mental surgery she had been performing through careful selection of morally instructive accounts was working, but the patient's appetite for marvel had grown enormous. She needed tales that could satisfy his hunger for the impossible, while continuing the delicate work of inner change. Enter the trader-adventurer who would become the most famous traveler in world literature, the sailor from Baghdad. But the 7 expeditions she was about to unfold weren't simply adventure stories. They were sophisticated explorations of masculine ambition, the relationship between risk and reward, and the spiritual journey from reckless youth to mature wisdom. Each expedition would represent a different stage in the evolution, from selfish acquisition to genuine understanding of life's deeper values. The first expedition established the template for everything that would follow. A young trader from Baghdad, inheriting substantial riches from his father, squanders his fortune on luxury and pleasure. Facing poverty, he decides to risk everything on a commercial expedition to distant lands. The setup immediately established themes that would resonate throughout the cycle: the tension between security and exploration, the allure of riches beyond imagination, and the price of pursuing dreams that exceed ordinary human limitations. But the sailor's first expedition quickly transcends mere commercial adventure. His ship stops at what appears to be a tropical island, perfect for rest and provisioning. The crew lights cooking fires, prepares meals, and begins to relax, only to discover that their island is actually a colossal whale that has been sleeping on the ocean's surface for so long that soil and vegetation have accumulated on its back. When the creature awakens and dives, our protagonist finds himself abandoned in the middle of the ocean, seemingly doomed to death by drowning. This opening catastrophe serves multiple functions beyond simple excitement. The false island represents the danger of accepting surface appearances without deeper investigation, a lesson directly relevant to the listening sovereign's tendency toward hasty judgment. The whale's awakening symbolizes how comfortable assumptions can be shattered by forces beyond human control or understanding. Most importantly, the sailor's survival through quick thinking and determination demonstrates that apparent disasters can become opportunities for those with sufficient courage and intelligence. His rescue by a passing ship leads to discovery of the legendary Valley of Diamonds, where enormous gems litter the ground but are impossible to retrieve due to the valley's inaccessible location and the giant serpents that guard the treasure. The local traders have developed an ingenious system. They throw chunks of meat into the valley, and massive rocks, legendary birds large enough to carry off elephants, retrieve the meat to feed their young. Diamonds stick to the meat, allowing the traders to harvest gems from the birds' nests. The narrator's description of this marvel served multiple purposes in her mental campaign. The Valley of Diamonds represented the relationship between desire and accessibility. The most valuable things in life often require indirect approaches rather than direct assault. The protagonist's solution to the challenge reveals characteristic cleverness. He ties himself to a chunk of meat and allows a rock to carry him into the valley, where he can gather diamonds before being carried back to the surface. The episode demonstrates that achieving extraordinary goals requires extraordinary methods, but also extraordinary risks. The second expedition escalated both the scale of exploration and the sophistication of moral instruction. The sailor, now prosperous from his first expedition, again succumbs to wanderlust and sets out for even more distant lands. This journey introduces the famous episode of the Old Man of the Sea, one of the collection's most complex encounters between human ambition and supernatural malevolence. The old man appears to be a harmless, elderly traveler who asks the protagonist to carry him across a stream. But once mounted on the trader's shoulders, the creature reveals his true nature. His legs transform into iron bands that cannot be removed, and he begins controlling the sailor's movements through pain and exhaustion. The protagonist becomes, essentially, a slave, forced to carry his tormentor wherever the old man wishes to go, fed only enough to maintain his strength for continued service. This episode functions as a sophisticated allegory for how seemingly innocent commitments can become forms of mental or spiritual bondage. The old man represents the way that addictions, obsessions, or unhealthy relationships can begin with what appears to be simple assistance, but gradually take complete control of a person's life. The protagonist's eventual escape, through getting the old man drunk and then smashing his head with a rock, demonstrates that breaking free from such bondage requires both cunning and decisive violence against the controlling force. The mental relevance to the listening ruler was unmistakable. His own obsession with his bride's betrayal had functioned like the old man of the sea, taking control of his thoughts and actions, forcing him into behaviors that served the obsession rather than his own genuine interests or his kingdom's welfare. The episode suggested that breaking free from such mental bondage might require dramatic action against the controlling force. In his case, the systematic execution of innocent women. The third expedition introduced themes of social responsibility and the relationship between individual survival and community welfare. The protagonist's ship is attacked by giant apes who kill most of the crew and strand the survivors on an island inhabited by a one-eyed giant who roasts and eats human beings. The survivors must work together to devise an escape plan that requires both individual courage and collective action. The giant represents the kind of arbitrary, predatory power that destroys human communities without regard for fairness or mercy, a clear parallel to the kind of ruler the listening sovereign had become. But the chronicle's focus on collective resistance demonstrates that even the most overwhelming individual power can be defeated by intelligent cooperation and shared sacrifice. The sailor's role in the escape plan reveals his evolution from pure self-interest toward genuine leadership. Rather than simply seeking his own survival, he becomes responsible for coordinating the group's efforts and ensuring that as many people as possible can escape. His growing sense of responsibility for others represents a crucial stage in his development from selfish adventurer toward mature leader. The fourth expedition delved into themes of cultural relativism and the danger of judging other societies by one's own standards. The protagonist is captured by cannibals who fatten their prisoners before eating them, but he refuses to eat their food and gradually wastes away until he appears too thin to be worth consuming. His escape depends on his ability to understand and exploit the cultural assumptions of his captors while maintaining his own moral principles under extreme pressure. This episode served as sophisticated commentary on the relationship between survival and moral compromise. The sailor's refusal to eat the fattening food represents his unwillingness to participate in the system that would ultimately destroy him, even when such participation might make his captivity more comfortable in the short term. His escape demonstrates that maintaining moral principles can actually serve practical survival, though often in ways that aren't immediately apparent. The fifth expedition explored themes of greed, obsession, and the mental price of pursuing riches beyond reasonable limits. The protagonist becomes involved in trading enormous eggs laid by the legendary rock birds, despite warnings about the dangers of disturbing these creatures. His pursuit of profit leads to disaster when angry rocks destroy his ship and kill most of his companions. This journey marks a crucial turning point in the sailor's development. For the first time, his own greed and poor judgment directly cause suffering for others. The episode forces him to confront the moral implications of his adventuring and to consider whether the pursuit of fortune justifies the risks he imposes on those who travel with him. The Old Man of the Sea reappears in this expedition, but now the protagonist immediately recognizes the danger and refuses to provide assistance. This demonstrates his growing wisdom and his ability to learn from previous mistakes rather than repeating them. The episode suggests that true maturity involves recognizing dangerous patterns and having the courage to refuse participation, even when such refusal might appear selfish or unhelpful. The sixth expedition represented the traveler's most profound encounter with mortality and the ultimate futility of earthly accumulation. He discovers an underground river lined with diamonds and precious stones, but populated by deadly serpents and accessible only through a cave system that may have no exit. His pursuit of these ultimate treasures forces him to confront the possibility that he might die in the attempt to acquire riches he could never live to enjoy. This journey functions as a meditation on the relationship between material achievement and spiritual fulfillment. The protagonist's growing awareness that no amount of fortune can guarantee happiness or security represents a crucial stage in his evolution toward wisdom. The underground river serves as a metaphor for the unconscious mind, where the most valuable treasures, self-knowledge, wisdom, peace, can be found, but only by those willing to risk everything in the pursuit. The seventh and final expedition brought the sailor's adventures full circle, while demonstrating his complete change from reckless youth to mature sage. Now, an older man, with vast experience and accumulated wisdom, he undertakes one last expedition, not for riches or excitement, but to help others and to find ultimate peace with his place in the world. This final journey introduces Elephant's Graveyard, where these magnificent creatures go to die, leaving behind enormous accumulations of ivory that represent fortune beyond calculation. But the protagonist's encounter with this natural treasure demonstrates his evolved understanding of the relationship between acquisition and satisfaction. He takes only what he needs, showing respect for the elephant's sacred space and recognition that endless accumulation serves no meaningful purpose. The cycle concludes with the traveler's return to Baghdad, where he uses his riches not for personal luxury, but for supporting others, helping fellow traders, and sharing the wisdom gained through his extraordinary experiences. His final state represents the ideal of the trader-philosopher, someone who has pursued worldly achievement to its ultimate limits and discovered that true satisfaction comes from service to others and acceptance of life's deeper mysteries. But the narrator's presentation of the sailor cycle wasn't complete without introducing its most revolutionary element, the framing device of the porter. This second character, a poor man who earns his living carrying loads for prosperous customers, serves as the audience for the traveler's accounts. The interaction between the two explores themes of class, opportunity, and the relationship between effort and reward that struck directly at contemporary social realities. The porter's initial resentment of the sailor's prosperity, expressed in a bitter poem about the unfairness of fate, represents the voice of those who lack the resources to pursue extraordinary adventures, but must struggle simply to survive. The traveler's response, sharing both his riches and his stories, demonstrates the responsibility that those who achieve success bear toward those who lack similar opportunities. Then came the chronicles that would prove even more influential for world literature, though they entered the collection through routes that the listening ruler could never have imagined. Aladdin and the Wonderful Lamp would become perhaps the most famous of all the Arabian Nights tales, but its origins lay not in medieval Arabic manuscripts, but in the imagination of an 18th century French translator who added it to his version of the collection. Antoine Galland's addition of Aladdin to his French translation represents one of history's most successful acts of literary forgery. The account he created drew on genuine Middle Eastern folklore, but synthesized these elements into something entirely new, a rags-to-riches fantasy that would speak directly to European audiences while maintaining the exotic flavor they expected from Oriental literature. The Chronicle of Aladdin ibn Abi Talib, a poor tailor's son in an unnamed Chinese city that bears no resemblance to actual China, begins with themes that would resonate across cultures and centuries: class resentment, frustrated ambition, and the dream that extraordinary power might be accessible to ordinary people. Aladdin's discovery of the wonderful lamp in an underground treasure chamber represents the ultimate fantasy of instant change through magical intervention. But Galland's genius lay in grounding this fantasy within recognizable social and personal realities. Aladdin's initial use of the lamp's power reveals characteristic human nature. His first wishes focus on immediate physical needs: food, shelter, clothing, rather than abstract desires for power or wisdom. His gradual education in the effective use of supernatural assistance demonstrates the learning curve that accompanies any dramatic change in circumstances. The account's exploration of the relationship between magical power and personal responsibility proved particularly sophisticated. Aladdin's jinn serves his commands without question, but the young man must still make intelligent decisions about what to request and how to manage the consequences of his wishes. The lamp provides unlimited potential, but actualizing that potential requires wisdom, planning, and understanding of human nature. Aladdin's courtship of Princess Badr al-Budur introduces themes of social mobility and the tension between merit and birth that spoke directly to changing European attitudes about class and aristocracy. The princess's father, the Sultan, initially rejects Aladdin's marriage proposal because of his humble origins, but is gradually won over by demonstrations of the young man's magical prosperity and capabilities. The chronicle's most complex character proves to be the evil sorcerer who originally led Aladdin to the lamp. This figure represents the dark side of the pursuit of power, someone who has studied magic extensively but uses his knowledge purely for selfish purposes, without regard for the suffering he causes others. His rivalry with Aladdin becomes a contest between inherited supernatural power, the lamp, and acquired magical knowledge, the sorcerer's training. The sorcerer's ultimate defeat demonstrates that natural goodness, combined with supernatural assistance, can triumph over sophisticated evil that relies purely on accumulated knowledge and ruthless application of power. The message was particularly relevant to contemporary European audiences grappling with questions about the relationship between traditional authority and emerging democratic ideals. Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves represented another of Galland's additions that would achieve independent literary immortality. Like Aladdin, this chronicle drew on genuine folklore elements but synthesized them into something distinctly new. An account that explored themes of economic inequality, criminal organization, and the moral complexity of survival in societies where legal authorities provide inadequate protection for ordinary citizens. The famous phrase, "Open Sesame," represents more than a magical password. It symbolizes the moment when hidden sources of prosperity become accessible to those clever enough to discover the secret. Ali Baba's accidental discovery of the Thieves' Cave demonstrates how ordinary people can sometimes gain access to resources that powerful criminal organizations have accumulated through violence and exploitation. But the chronicle's moral framework proves more complex than simple good versus evil. Ali Baba's appropriation of stolen treasure raises questions about the ethics of taking property from criminals, while his subsequent conflict with the surviving thieves explores the practical consequences of challenging organized criminal power. The account suggests that moral purity may be a luxury that those struggling for survival cannot always afford. The character of Morgiana, Ali Baba's clever slave girl, represents one of the collection's most sophisticated explorations of intelligence, loyalty, and agency within restrictive social circumstances. Her repeated success in outwitting the thieves demonstrates that effective problem-solving often depends more on quick thinking and courage than on social status or formal authority. Morgiana's ultimate reward, freedom and marriage into Ali Baba's family, represents a fantasy of social mobility through merit and service that would prove particularly appealing to audiences in societies beginning to question traditional class structures. Her story suggests that intelligence and loyalty should be rewarded regardless of the social circumstances of one's birth. These later additions to the Arabian Nights collection represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the chronicles and their audiences. The original Arabic accounts had been created within and for Islamic civilization, carrying cultural assumptions and moral frameworks that reflected the values of medieval Middle Eastern societies. Gallen's additions, while maintaining the exotic flavor that European audiences expected from Oriental literature, actually reflected European concerns about class, power, and social mobility, disguised as Middle Eastern fantasy. The success of these hybrid chronicles demonstrates the collection's fundamental adaptability, its capacity to absorb new elements while maintaining its essential character as a repository of human wisdom expressed through entertainment. The Arabian Nights had become not just a Middle Eastern cultural artifact, but a truly international literature capable of speaking to universal human concerns while adapting to the specific needs and interests of different audiences. For the listening ruler, these chronicles of extraordinary individuals who achieved remarkable success through combination of cleverness, courage, and supernatural assistance represented the culmination of his narrator's mental campaign. He had been gradually exposed to models of leadership, fairness, and human possibility that challenged every assumption underlying his systematic cruelty. The executioner's block remained in the palace courtyard, but its power over the royal imagination had been almost completely displaced by more compelling visions of what authority could accomplish when guided by wisdom rather than wounded rage. As the third year of storytelling drew to a close, something unprecedented was happening in the royal bedchamber. The headsman's axe had not tasted blood for nearly 1,000 days. Palace servants who had grown accustomed to the daily ritual of preparing fresh straw to absorb royal victims' blood found themselves reassigned to ordinary duties. The kingdom's daughters were returning from exile, and wedding celebrations, actual celebrations of love, rather than funeral preparations, once again echoed through the capital's streets. But the most remarkable shift was occurring within the monarch himself. The man who had once lain awake each dawn, calculating the precise moment when another life would end, now found himself sincerely eager for evening to arrive, not because it brought the satisfaction of completed revenge, but because it promised new wonders, fresh insights, and the peculiar joy that comes from discovering unexpected depths in familiar narratives. The brutal logic that had once seemed unassailable, that all women were fundamentally treacherous and therefore deserved preemptive elimination, had been gradually displaced by something far more complex and ultimately more satisfying. Authentic curiosity about human nature in all its infinite variety. The vizier's daughter understood that she had reached a crucial juncture. Nearly 3 years of nightly storytelling had accomplished the seemingly impossible. She had converted a systematically murderous leader into someone capable of wonder, empathy, and real moral reflection. But survival was no longer her primary concern. She had become invested in completing the healing process she had begun, in ensuring that the shifts she had worked so carefully to nurture would prove permanent rather than temporary. The tales she chose for these final months reflected her evolved comprehension of what the monarch needed to hear. Gone were the simple moral fables and supernatural adventures that had dominated the early period. Instead, she began to share accounts that dealt directly with the complexities of affection, forgiveness, and the possibility that even the most damaged connections could be mended through patience, empathy, and sincere commitment to growth. The account of the prince and the Ifrit's mistress marked the beginning of this final phase. This chronicle told of a young royal who falls deeply in love with a woman who is secretly the beloved of a powerful supernatural being. The prince's passion leads him into direct conflict with forces far beyond his comprehension or control. But rather than being destroyed by this impossible situation, he learns to navigate it through insight, patience, and ultimate respect for the complexity of affection itself. The tale's central insight, that true love often requires accepting situations that seem to violate our basic assumptions about possession, exclusivity, and control, struck directly at the heart of the king's psychological wounds. His original trauma had stemmed from his inability to accept that his wife's affections might be more complex than simple binary loyalty or betrayal. The prince in this chronicle faces an even more impossible situation, but ultimately finds peace by recognizing that affection cannot be possessed or controlled, only experienced and honored. The Chronicle of Kamar al-Zaman and the Princess Budur explored themes of destined affection, patient endurance, and the power of dreams to bridge impossible distances between hearts meant for each other. This extended account, which unfolded over many evenings, told of 2 royal children who fall in love through dreams before ever meeting in waking life. Their eventual union requires overcoming geographical separation, family opposition, magical interference, and their own psychological barriers to trust and commitment. But the tale's most sophisticated element was its exploration of how true affection develops through mutual recognition, rather than simple physical attraction or social convenience. Both Kamar al-Zaman and Princess Budur must learn to see past surface appearances and cultural expectations to recognize the essential compatibility of their souls. Their account demonstrates that lasting bonds require ongoing choice, continuous growth, and willingness to work through difficulties, rather than abandoning the connection when challenges arise. The storyteller's presentation of this extended chronicle served multiple functions in her therapeutic campaign. She was showing the listening monarch that affection could survive separation, misunderstanding, and even betrayal if both parties remained committed to growth and mutual empathy. More importantly, she was demonstrating that the kind of absolute trust he had demanded from his wife and had been destroyed by losing was perhaps an unrealistic expectation that set bonds up for failure rather than success. The tale of the 2 viziers and Anis al-Jalis delved into questions of loyalty, political pressure, and the moral complexity of bonds that exist within systems of power and authority. This chronicle told of a young woman whose beauty and intelligence make her a prize that powerful men compete to possess, but whose own desires and agency are rarely considered in these competitions. The account explored how authentic connections can develop even within circumstances that seem to reduce human beings to commodities or political tools. The chronicle's most powerful insights concerned the difference between bonds based on possession and those grounded in mutual respect and real affection. Anes al-Jalis, whose name means intimate companion, represents the possibility that even women in seemingly powerless positions can exercise agency, influence, and ultimately choice about their own destinies. Her account suggests that insight, patience, and strategic thinking can sometimes overcome even systematic oppression. For the listening monarch, this chronicle provided a radically different model for comprehending connections between men and women. Rather than seeing women as inherently untrustworthy creatures who required constant surveillance and control, he was being exposed to female characters who demonstrated intelligence, loyalty, and moral strength when treated with respect and given real choice about their circumstances. The account of Ghanim ibn Ayyub presented perhaps the collection's most direct exploration of forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility that even the most apparently hopeless situations could be converted through sustained commitment to virtue and patient endurance of injustice. Ghanim, a young trader, becomes involved with a woman who belongs to the caliph's household, leading to false accusations, exile, and years of suffering for a crime he didn't commit. But rather than becoming bitter or seeking revenge against those who wronged him, Ghanim maintains his integrity, continues to act virtuously despite his circumstances, and ultimately proves through his actions that his character is fundamentally sound. His vindication comes not through violence or political maneuvering, but through the gradual recognition by others that his consistent behavior over time demonstrates his essential trustworthiness. The chronicle's resolution, which sees Ghanim not only cleared of false charges, but rewarded for his patience and virtue, provided the listening king with a model for comprehending how authentic character reveals itself over time through sustained action rather than momentary choices. The account suggested that his own hasty judgment of his wife's character, based on a single incident, might have been fundamentally flawed methodology for comprehending human nature. As these final chronicles unfolded evening after evening, the storyteller began to weave in increasingly direct references to her own situation and the extraordinary bond that had developed between herself and her royal audience. The tales became more explicitly about the power of narrative to heal, transform, and create empathy between people who might otherwise remain forever separated by differences in power, experience, or worldview. The tale of the fisherman and the four-colored fish returned to themes from much earlier in the collection, but now with added layers of meaning that reflected the depth of comprehension that had developed between narrator and listener. The account of the enchanted city, where half the population had been turned to stone, served as an explicit metaphor for the condition of the kingdom itself when the storytelling began, a realm where the king's personal trauma had created widespread suffering and spiritual death. But now, this familiar chronicle contained a crucial additional element. The visiting sultan who breaks the enchantment doesn't accomplish this restoration through violence or assertion of superior power. Instead, he succeeds by comprehending the magical dynamics involved, by showing patience and insight in his investigation, and ultimately by demonstrating real concern for the welfare of all the kingdom's inhabitants, including those who had been responsible for creating the original curse. The parallel to the storyteller's own situation was becoming impossible to ignore. She had functioned as the wise visitor who understood the magical dynamics of trauma and systematic cruelty. Through patient investigation of the monarch's psychological wounds and sustained demonstration of alternative possibilities. She had gradually broken the enchantment that had turned half the kingdom's population into stone, or in this case, into terrified refugees, fleeing a leader who had ceased to see his subjects as fully human. During the final weeks of the 1001 Chronicles, an extraordinary development began to manifest itself in the royal bedchamber. The storyteller announced that she was carrying the king's child. In fact, that she had conceived not once, but 3 times during their prolonged association. 3 sons had been born in secret, cared for by trusted servants, and were now old enough to be presented to their father. This revelation altered the entire dynamic of their bond in ways that neither participant could have fully anticipated. The monarch was confronted with the undeniable evidence that his systematic killing of wives had been preventing exactly what he claimed to desire: the continuation of his royal lineage through children whose legitimacy was unquestionable. His policy of preemptive murder had been systematically destroying the very possibility of achieving his supposed goals. But more importantly, the existence of these 3 children meant that the storyteller's death would now create real tragedy, rather than simply eliminating another potential threat. These boys would grow up without their mother, would bear the psychological burden of knowing that their father had killed the woman who gave them life, and would inherit a kingdom shaped by systematic cruelty rather than insight and fairness. The symbolic significance of bearing 3 children during the storytelling period was profound. In many traditions, the number 3 represents completion, synthesis, and the resolution of apparent contradictions through the discovery of higher truth. The 3 children embodied the possibility that the fundamental conflict between the king's desire for security and his need for human connection could be resolved through growing into a more mature comprehension of bonds, trust, and the nature of affection itself. The first child represented hope, the possibility that new life could emerge even from circumstances that seemed designed to prevent growth and renewal. The second symbolized patience, the comprehension that real development requires sustained effort over time, rather than dramatic single moments of insight. The third embodied insight, the recognition that the most valuable outcomes often require accepting uncertainty, vulnerability, and the inherent risks that accompany any authentic human bond. As the storyteller prepared to conclude her extraordinary enterprise, she made a decision that revealed the depth of her confidence in the shifts she had accomplished. Rather than continuing indefinitely with new chronicles, rather than maintaining the fiction that her survival depended on providing fresh entertainment each evening, she chose to end the storytelling voluntarily. The 1001st account would be her last, not because she had exhausted her repertoire, but because the original purpose of the enterprise had been achieved. This decision represented the ultimate expression of trust and the final test of the development she had been working to accomplish. If the king's growth was authentic rather than superficial, if his capacity for mercy had truly been restored rather than simply temporarily engaged by entertainment, then he would be able to choose life over death, restoration over revenge, hope over fear, even when the magical compulsion of unfinished tales no longer forced that choice upon him. The final evening arrived with a weight of significance that both participants felt deeply. The storyteller had prepared no new chronicle for this ultimate session. Instead, she spoke directly to the monarch about what they had accomplished together, about the journey they had shared from the brink of systematic murder to the possibility of renewed life and hope. She reminded him of the chronicles they had shared, the supernatural adventures that had rekindled his capacity for wonder, the moral fables that had challenged his assumptions about fairness and mercy, the political allegories that had provided new models for comprehending leadership and responsibility. The romantic tales that had demonstrated the possibility of mending even the most damaged bonds through patience, empathy, and sustained commitment to growth. More importantly, she spoke about the man he had become through sustained exposure to these accounts. The king who had begun this process as someone incapable of seeing women as fully human had evolved into someone who could recognize intelligence, insight, and moral strength regardless of gender. The leader who had confused harsh judgment with effective governance had discovered that real authority came through comprehension, investigation, and sincere concern for subjects' welfare, rather than through intimidation and systematic cruelty. The monarch's response to this ultimate test revealed the completeness of his development. Rather than ordering her death now that the entertainment had ended, rather than reverting to the systematic logic that had originally seemed so compelling, he formally pardoned her and declared an end to the brutal policy that had defined his reign for 3 years. More importantly, he asked her to become not just his wife in name, but his partner in governance, recognizing that her insight and comprehension could help him become the kind of leader his kingdom deserved. But the chronicle's conclusion contained one final element that elevated it beyond simple personal redemption into something approaching universal significance. The king's development didn't remain a private matter between two individuals. It became the foundation for a renewed kingdom where fairness, mercy, and insight replaced fear, revenge, and systematic cruelty as the organizing principles of governance. The 1001 Chronicles had demonstrated that the human capacity for growth and development was virtually unlimited, that even the most damaged hearts could be mended through sustained exposure to beauty, insight, and real empathy. The collection stood as proof that narrative art wasn't simply entertainment, but a fundamental tool for human development, capable of accomplishing shifts that political pressure, religious instruction, and moral argument had failed to achieve. The vizier's daughter had gambled everything on the proposition that the right tales, told at the right moments, could literally save lives and transform civilizations. Her success proved that this wasn't merely wishful thinking, but practical insight of the highest order. She had demonstrated that storytelling, when practiced with sufficient skill and comprehension, represented one of humanity's most sophisticated technologies for mending trauma, building empathy, and creating the kind of shared awareness that makes real community possible. The headsman's block was removed from the palace courtyard and replaced with a fountain whose flowing water symbolized the renewal of life and hope. The kingdom's daughters returned from exile to find a realm converted, where their safety was guaranteed, not by systematic elimination of all possible threats, but by a leader who had learned to see them as complete human beings, deserving of respect, protection, and real opportunity for happiness. The 1001 Chronicles had ended, but their influence would prove eternal. They had demonstrated that even the darkest human impulses could be converted through sustained exposure to beauty, insight, and the peculiar magic that emerges when someone skilled in the arts of narrative chooses to use those arts in service of restoration rather than mere entertainment. The collection would inspire countless future storytellers to attempt similar acts of development, proving that the power to alter hearts and minds through carefully chosen words was among humanity's most precious and enduring gifts. The echo of that final evening in the royal bedchamber would reverberate across continents and centuries, though neither the vizier's daughter nor her transformed monarch could have imagined the extraordinary journey their collection would undertake. What began as a desperate survival strategy in a medieval Middle Eastern palace would evolve into one of humanity's most influential literary achievements, reshaping how entire civilizations understood the power of narrative art to transform hearts, minds, and cultures. But the path from Baghdad's royal court to global literary immortality was neither straight nor simple. The collection that had saved a woman's life and healed a damaged kingdom would itself undergo countless transformations, translations, additions, and reinterpretations as it traveled through different cultures, languages, and historical periods. Each new version would reflect the values, fears, and dreams of its particular audience, while somehow maintaining the essential magic that had made the original so compelling. The earliest manuscripts of what would become known as the Arabian Nights began circulating through the Islamic world during the 10th and 11th centuries. These handwritten copies, laboriously reproduced by scribes in Damascus, Cairo, and Cordoba, varied considerably in content, organization, and literary sophistication. Some focused primarily on the frame narrative of the storytelling woman and her royal audience, while others expanded the embedded tales into vast cycles that could occupy readers for months. The collection's journey westward began in earnest during the Crusades, when European knights and merchants encountered these narratives in the markets and libraries of captured cities. But the real transformation occurred in the early 18th century, when a French Orientalist named Antoine Galland discovered a 14th century Syrian manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale and recognized its extraordinary potential for European audiences hungry for exotic entertainment. Galland's translation, published between 1704 and 1717 as Les Mille et Une Nuits, represented far more than simple linguistic conversion. It was a complete cultural adaptation that transformed a complex Islamic literary achievement into something that could speak to European sensibilities, while maintaining enough exotic flavor to seem authentically Oriental. Galland didn't just translate. He edited, expanded, and in some cases entirely invented new material that he believed would appeal to French readers. The French scholars' most audacious additions, Aladdin, Ali Baba, and the 7 Voyages of Sinbad, became so popular that they effectively colonized the collection's identity in Western imagination. European readers came to think of these tales as the real Arabian Nights, despite the fact that they existed in no Arabic manuscript and reflected European rather than Middle Eastern narrative sensibilities. Galland had created what amounted to literary forgery that proved more influential than the authentic original. But Galland's cultural translation served a crucial function beyond simple entertainment. It introduced European readers to narrative techniques and moral perspectives that challenged fundamental assumptions about literature, society, and human nature. The idea that stories could be embedded within other stories infinitely, that entertainment could carry serious philosophical weight, that non-European cultures possess sophisticated literary traditions. These concepts revolutionized European thinking about the possibilities of narrative art. The success of Galland's version triggered an explosion of interest in Oriental literature that would shape European Romanticism for the next century. Writers like Lord Byron, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Victor Hugo found in the Arabian Nights a model for literature that could be simultaneously popular and profound, exotic and universal, entertaining and transformative. The collection's influence on European literary development would prove as significant as its original impact on medieval Islamic culture. English translations followed the French success, each reflecting the particular cultural moment and audience for which it was intended. The anonymous Grub Street translation of 1706 to 1708 focused on adventure and entertainment, stripping away much of the original's philosophical complexity in favor of straightforward storytelling. Edward Lane's Victorian version, 1838 to 1841, emphasized scholarly accuracy and moral instruction, presenting the tales as windows into Islamic civilization, while carefully editing out elements that might offend contemporary British sensibilities. But it was Richard Burton's complete translation, 1885 to 1888, that created the most lasting impact on English-speaking audiences. Burton's version was deliberately provocative, emphasizing the collection's erotic elements, religious diversity, and moral complexity in ways that challenged Victorian assumptions about propriety, spirituality, and cultural superiority. His extensive footnotes and commentary revealed the depth of Islamic civilization, while arguing for the universal relevance of the collection's psychological and philosophical insights. Burton's translation coincided with the height of European colonialism, when Western powers were asserting political and cultural dominance over much of the Islamic world. In this context, the Arabian Nights served a complex and sometimes contradictory function. For some readers, it reinforced stereotypes about Oriental sensuality, irrationality, and despotism. For others, it demonstrated the sophistication and wisdom of Islamic civilization in ways that complicated simplistic colonial narratives about Western superiority and Eastern backwardness. The collection's influence on modern literature extended far beyond simple inspiration or imitation. Writers like Jorge Luis Borges recognized in the Arabian Nights a model for exploring the relationship between reality and fiction, between lived experience and narrative construction. Borges's labyrinths, infinite libraries, and recursive stories all drew explicitly on techniques pioneered in the medieval Islamic collection. Italo Calvino found in the frame narrative structure a method for exploring how individual stories gain meaning through their relationship to larger narrative contexts. His If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler directly adapts the Arabian Nights technique of embedding multiple stories within an overarching framework, while using this structure to examine contemporary questions about reading, interpretation, and the relationship between authors and audiences. Modern Arabic literature itself was profoundly influenced by the collection's global success and the questions it raised about cultural identity, literary tradition, and the relationship between local and universal themes. Writers like Naguib Mahfouz explicitly engaged with the Arabian Nights as both inspiration and challenge, creating works that honored the collection's achievement while addressing contemporary Middle Eastern realities. Mahfouz's Arabian Nights and Days reimagined the original characters and situations in ways that explored modern questions about political authority, social justice, and individual agency. His Nobel Prize-winning work demonstrated that the collection's themes remained relevant to contemporary audiences, while showing how traditional narrative forms could be adapted to address current concerns without losing their essential power. The Arabian Nights' influence on popular culture proved equally transformative. Hollywood's various adaptations, from Douglas Fairbanks's swashbuckling Thief of Baghdad, 1924, to Disney's animated Aladdin, 1992, introduced the collection's characters and themes to global audiences, while often dramatically altering their cultural context and meaning. These adaptations created a version of the Arabian Nights that was simultaneously more widely known and more culturally distorted than any previous translation. Disney's Aladdin, in particular, demonstrates both the collection's enduring appeal and the challenges of cross-cultural adaptation. The film's enormous commercial success proved that audiences around the world remained hungry for the kind of wonder, adventure, and transformation that the original collection had provided. But the movie's Americanized Middle Eastern setting, its replacement of Islamic cultural elements with generic, exotic imagery, and its focus on individual achievement over communal responsibility, reflected contemporary Western values. rather than the original's Islamic worldview. The collection's impact on feminist literary criticism opened entirely new dimensions of interpretation and appreciation. Scholars like Fedwa Malti Douglas and Wenchin Ouyang recognized in the figure of the storytelling woman a powerful model for understanding how narrative art could serve as resistance to patriarchal authority. The frame narrative structure, where a woman's voice literally saves lives and transforms political reality, provided a template for analyzing how storytelling itself could function as a form of political action. This feminist reading revealed aspects of the collection that had been overlooked or minimized in earlier interpretations. The prevalence of intelligent, resourceful female characters throughout the embedded tales, the collection's subtle critique of masculine violence and authority, its celebration of wit and wisdom over brute force. All these elements took on new significance when viewed through the lens of gender analysis. Contemporary Middle Eastern feminists found in the storytelling woman a symbol of possibility that resonated with modern struggles for women's rights and agency. The character who had used intelligence and narrative skill to transform a murderous tyrant into a just ruler provided inspiration for women seeking to challenge contemporary forms of patriarchal oppression through education, literature, and political activism. The digital age has created entirely new possibilities for experiencing and interpreting the Arabian Nights. Interactive websites allow readers to explore different manuscript traditions, compare translations, and trace the evolution of individual tales across cultures and centuries. Hypertext fiction experiments with the collection's nested structure to create new forms of non-linear narrative that would have been impossible in print format. Video games have adapted the collection's themes of transformation, adventure, and moral choice into interactive experiences where players can literally inhabit the roles of characters navigating complex ethical decisions. These digital adaptations raise fascinating questions about the relationship between traditional storytelling and contemporary media, while demonstrating the collection's continued relevance to new generations of audiences. The Arabian Nights' influence on contemporary psychology and therapeutic practice represents perhaps its most unexpected legacy. Modern narrative therapy draws explicitly on the collection's demonstration that carefully chosen stories can reshape how people understand their own experiences and possibilities. The recognition that identity itself is partly constructed through the stories we tell ourselves, and others owes much to the medieval Islamic understanding of narrative as a transformative force. Research into the psychological effects of storytelling has validated many of the intuitions embedded in the original collection. Studies show that exposure to diverse narratives can increase empathy, expand moral imagination, and provide cognitive tools for processing difficult experiences. The storytelling woman's strategy for healing trauma through sustained narrative intervention has found scientific support in contemporary understanding of how the human mind processes and integrates experience. The collection's treatment of cross-cultural encounter and understanding has gained new relevance in an era of global migration and cultural interaction. The Arabian Nights' demonstration that stories can bridge differences between people from radically different backgrounds provides a model for contemporary efforts to build understanding across religious, ethnic, and national boundaries. Educational initiatives around the world have used the collection as a tool for teaching cultural literacy, narrative analysis, and ethical reasoning. The tale's combination of entertainment and instruction, their embedding of complex moral questions within engaging adventures, and their demonstration that wisdom can emerge from unexpected sources, make them ideal for educational purposes across diverse cultural contexts. But perhaps the collection's most profound legacy lies in its demonstration that literature can literally save lives. The story of a woman who used narrative art to transform a murderous tyrant into a just ruler provides hope that artistic expression can make meaningful differences in political and social reality. In an era when writers, journalists, and storytellers around the world face persecution and violence, the Arabian Nights stands as testimony to the potentially transformative power of the human voice, raised in service of truth, beauty, and justice. The collection's journey from medieval Baghdad to global literary immortality demonstrates that great art transcends the boundaries of its original cultural context, while somehow maintaining its essential character and power. Each new translation, adaptation, and interpretation adds layers of meaning while preserving the core insight that stories matter, that they can heal trauma, build empathy, challenge injustice, and create the kind of shared understanding that makes human community possible. Today, as conflicts rage across the Middle East and cultural tensions divide communities around the world, the Arabian Nights offers a reminder that Islamic civilization has contributed profound wisdom to global human heritage. The collection stands as evidence that creativity, intelligence, and moral insight are universal human capacities that transcend religious, ethnic, and national boundaries. The 1001 tales that began as one woman's desperate strategy for survival have become humanity's shared inheritance, a treasure house of narrative technique, moral wisdom, and artistic achievement that continues to inspire, challenge, and transform new generations of readers, writers, and dreamers. The storytelling woman's voice echoes still, reminding us that the right words, spoken at the right moment, can indeed change the world.